This is Orange Nation Overtime with Stephen Fonte and Paulie Sibilia.
Welcome into Orange Nation Overtime, everyone. Alongside Paulie Sibilia, I'm Stephen Fonte as we have made it to Friday, and we kicked off the show today with some news on the SU football schedule. When the schedule was released, Paulie, we were told that either the SMU game on Halloween or the Clemson game on the weekend of November 7th, one of those games would be a Friday game, one of those would be a Saturday. As it turns out, they're both Saturday games, and you say not a good thing.
Not good, my friend. Because it hurts you in the ACC if you don't have eyes on your games. You're paid by viewership.
Right. You get more for the more people that watch you. Now, I will say this: if Syracuse ends up being good,
yes,
there's a chance that SMU and Clemson and Louisville and those kinds of games could be on national TV. You might get like an ESPN time slot or an ABC time slot, depending on how good they are. And that certainly would make up the difference for not being on a weeknight. But all things being equal, you want to be on those weeknights if possible, and Syracuse missed out on an opportunity there.
Yeah, and you're not. Correct me if I'm wrong on this. Your game against Notre Dame isn't a guaranteed NBC game because it's a home game, right? It would be on.
That's a good question.
I think
it's just the home games on NBC. Right. I believe you're right in saying that.
Because you usually know going into the Notre Dame game what time you're going to play because NBC sets that immediately.
The one weeknight game that Syracuse has is the Thursday Pittsburgh game.
And then we got bad news on that, too.
Well, right. I was going to say, it came up during the show that is also the home opener for the Buffalo Bills. They're playing that Thursday night against the Lions. So some competition in this market for TV eyeballs, with the lone Thursday night game that they have. So, again, missed opportunity there, but the schedule is now set. SMU will be on Saturday, October 31st, which is Halloween, and then Clemson will be a Saturday game as well on November 7th. We did talk some NBA on the show today. We had a former Cuse guy on, Noah Eagle. We know him well. He was in my class. You asked that on the show today. It didn't have to really teach him anything. He came to me as pretty much a finished product, but Noah's been calling NBA games for NBC, and we had him on, and we let him off by, Paulie, you asked him for his thoughts on the hiring of Jerry McNamara at Syracuse University.
Yeah, excitement. I got to see him in Greenville during the NCAA tournament. It was great to actually just see him for the first time since I graduated, honestly. And you could tell, he was being coy and was just hopeful, I think, at that point that things would work out. He was very focused pregame on making sure that his team went out and played well, and they did. I think he proved a lot, obviously, in that game against Duke, playing essentially 5 guys for the entire game. And more than anything, I just think that he brings a juice, an excitement, a grit. He's going to get maximum level out of his players, both in terms of just their overall vibe and effort, but I think also in terms of maximizing what their potentials are. We saw that certainly with a guy like Gavin Doty, who I think Cuse fans are going to fall in love with this year. So excited for what's to come. I think, obviously he's one of our own, and that's a huge deal.
All right, let's talk some NBA playoffs here, and we'll get to the Knicks in a moment. But the Knicks are going to be watching just like the rest of us tonight. They're curious who they're going to play, and will it be the Cavs? Game 6 in Cleveland, they've been so good at home. They were able to steal that game in the late moments of regulation, then into overtime in Game 5 the other night in Detroit. Do you think the Cavs close it out tonight? What does this game come down to?
Yeah, I'm definitely curious. I know the rumor was that there's some level of a stomach bug going around that locker room, so certainly could be a real factor on how they play. I think the biggest factor, though, in all of them is how will James Harden look? The first 2 games of this series, James just looked like a shell of himself. And I did Game 1, and it almost at times looked like in Space Jam when the Monstars took the talent away from the players. So he was losing simple crossover dribbles that he's done in his sleep for the last decade and a half in the NBA. You just don't see that. And then in games 3, 4, and 5, he's looked like the stud that they hoped they got when they traded the Clippers for him. And certainly in the last 2 games in particular, but down the stretch in Game 3, he closed the game and got them on the board, and from there they've been off and rolling. So it's really going to come down to what James Harden they get, because historically in his career, and this goes back, of course, to college when they lost to Syracuse in the NCAA tournament, in the biggest games, and especially in games 6 and 7, a lot of these series, he has not performed at his highest level. And if they're going to win tonight, they need him to be James Harden and the guy that they expected to get when they gave away Darius Garland in a first-round pick.
So let's say it is Cleveland. Is that a good thing for the Knicks? I mean, they're obviously the lower of the two seeds, right, that they could play. They would get home court advantage if it is the Cavs. Who do you think the Knicks match up better with, Cleveland or Detroit?
Personally, I would say Cleveland. I think that Detroit, it's just the Cade Cunningham factor. I think a lot of people would point to Detroit and say, well, they're not as deep, and the playoffs have exposed some things, but I just think at some point, Jalen Duren, he has not played up to the standard that he set for himself, given the way he played in the regular season. But at some point, there's going to be a matchup for him that is better. And I think the Knicks is a matchup that's just better. The first round against Orlando, physical team, big bodies, Wendell Carter, excellent interior defender. And then you look against this series where you've got the reigning defensive player of the year from last year, Evan Mobley and Jared Allen, these twin towers. When you go to the next series against New York, and I think that Duren has a much better opportunity to be a productive offensive player against Karl-Anthony Towns, who struggles with fouls. And so then you flip it and you say, okay, well, how does Cleveland match up? You just feel better about each position. You feel better about the length they can put on Donovan Mitchell. You feel better about how they can neutralize a guy like Evan Mobley by putting Towns out on a perimeter. Jared Allen can get into foul trouble himself, and you bring Mitchell Robinson in, you can dominate the offensive glass. I just like that matchup better. I think the physicality of Detroit and the Cade Cunningham factor, it was almost like the boogeyman in the regular season, not to mention there is that shared experience from the first round last year. And if you go back and look at that series, a couple bounces in 2 of those games, and it's Detroit who's moving on. And so we know how closely contested those two would look. I just feel like Cleveland, we've seen against the Knicks a couple years ago, New York took real easy care of them in the first round.
New York has been obviously very impressive so far during these playoffs. What has impressed you the most about what the Knicks have done?
I think that they were willing to change who they've been all year as they got into the postseason and recognized they needed to. And credit to Mike Brown, who made a change late in the regular season from what they had done the majority of the year by getting Karl-Anthony Towns a little bit differently involved. And then in the first round, you saw those first couple games. I was there for the collapse in game 2, and the offense got stagnant. They started missing threes. Atlanta started making a couple, and it completely turned the tide of the game. So game 3 was a similar story. They finally said, okay, we got to go back to the drawing board here, and they put the ball in Towns' hands, sort of like Nikola Jokic, and allowed him to showcase his skill set, which is more than just elite scoring and rebounding. He's a really high-level passer from the top of the key, and he sees the floor at a very high rate. And so he had the 2 triple-doubles in round 1. I think he kind of brought that more into round 2, and what that also did is allowed for Jalen Brunson to get off the ball and has made his life easier. And so as a result, both sides of the ball have been taken care of. And what really impressed me is that without OG Anunoby, they just didn't miss a beat, a step, because it's one thing to say this guy's been starring in his role. I could argue that OG Anunoby in the postseason has just been playing like a star, period. He's creating his own offense, initiating with the ball in his hands, making tough shots at the end of the shot clock. That's what stars do in the NBA. And so now what really is afforded to them is after the sweep, you get the extra rest for OG. The hope is that he's healthy going into the conference finals, and you're kind of, clicking on all cylinders at that point.
So for the sake of argument, let's say they get by whoever's next, whether it's the Pistons or Cavs. What kind of chances would you give them in an NBA Finals? Let's again, for the sake of this discussion, we'll say either Thunder or Spurs. I would assume they would be underdogs and maybe healthy underdogs against both of those teams. What kind of chances would you give them against either the Thunder or Spurs in the NBA Finals?
Yeah, I would tell you that's probably a pretty accurate assessment and accurate assumption that I don't think many people would give them much of a chance going into those series. Now, I would point you back to last year's finals where really each round that Indiana played, they were an underdog, maybe outside of the first round. I would have to look back on what the pre-round odds looked like, pre-series odds looked like, but certainly in round 2 against Cleveland, going into that series, everybody said, well, the Cavaliers will take care of business. They didn't. I think going into the New York series, most people felt the Knicks would beat the Pacers. They didn't. And then going into the finals, they were an overwhelming underdog and pushed that to 7 games. And if Halliburton doesn't get hurt, you just never know. And so I think that it's a good reminder of kind of what the NBA looks like. And certainly the other part of it is you could go and look back at 2 different other series. Boston going into the playoffs this year was the overwhelming favorite to win the Eastern Conference, and that doesn't happen. They lose in round 1. And then that same Boston team last year against the Knicks going into that series was a heavy, heavy favorite, and they lose pretty handily. Now, Tatum gets hurt, but they were down already in that series on their way to going down 3-1 as he gets hurt. So it's not like Tatum was this huge difference maker earlier in that series that was going to turn the tide later. You never know. But my point is, one injury, one thing, one guy returning, like it all can make a difference. And so while I wouldn't, if at full strength and on paper, say the Knicks are going to beat either of those teams, I also wouldn't completely count it out.
All right, let's touch on the West, if we could. Spurs, T-Wolves, Game 6 tonight in Minnesota as the T-Wolves try to stave off elimination. Do you think the Spurs get this done tonight? And what are their chances against the Thunder in the Western Conference Finals?
Yeah, I'd say if I had to choose, I would say the Spurs win tonight. I think, if Wemby doesn't get ejected from that Game 4, they probably have already won the series and they're moving on. But he did, and so, again, it goes back to what we were just saying, where one decision, one whistle, one bounce, one injury, it changes the trajectory of a series. And you really can't count Anthony Edwards entirely out. I think he's proven that now over the last 3 years in the playoffs, where he just makes magic and refuses to lose and finds ways to continue his team season. But, again, on paper, if you're just saying without Dante DiVincenzo, it just feels like it's an overwhelming level of talent and continuity now and togetherness and vibe on the San Antonio side that it's just hard to overcome if something crazy doesn't happen. And so to move them on and see them against Oklahoma City, I had the pleasure of doing one of those matchups this year. It was actually the one time Oklahoma City beat San Antonio in OKC. And it was special because you can feel a legitimate animosity, certainly between Victor Wembanyama and Chet Holmgren. And then I think an extension of that is really the auxiliary pieces around those two. Certainly Shai Gilgeous-Alexander at the forefront of it, but now Dylan Harper, who's really starting to feel like that guy that we all expected him to be. Devin Vassell didn't play in that game. What does he do now that can change things? And we saw when they were fully healthy, San Antonio did have a formula that was successful against OKC. The thing that stands out to me about the Thunder, they're so incredibly deep, but you look at all these other teams that are super deep, and people love to go back to the Bulls when Jordan retired and went and played baseball. They went from 57 wins to 55. The Thunder, even with as deep as they are, would have a much greater fall off. And the reason I say that is when they've had, say, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander play this year, they've been essentially unbeatable. And when he didn't play, they were 8-6. And so when he's in there, I feel really confident that they can win 4 out of 7. But when he's not in there, and if something were to happen to him in the series, that's where I feel like San Antonio is going to be too much to overcome.
Have we seen LeBron play his last game? That's something we talked about on the show here the other day about his future. I say he's playing at such a high level. Why wouldn't he come back? But what do you think? Do you think we're going to see LeBron next year?
I do. I would say the question is really where. Is it back in L.A.? Does he go to Cleveland and do 1 year where it all started and where he brought a championship back to the city? Is it going to be in Golden State? There's a lot of talks in league circles that something like that could happen. Or does he go elsewhere? Does he go to New York? There was that clip from years ago when he first decided on L.A., and I think he was talking to D. Wade or somebody after a game and said it was either here or the Garden. And so I think there's a lot of speculation that maybe he just says, all right, the Knicks are a tailor-made situation to compete. I'll go take a veteran's minimum contract, play 1 year in New York, and ride off into the sunset maybe with a title. I'm incredibly curious about that because I do think he likes the aspect of living in LA, having all of his other ventures out there. He's got his son on the team. He's got his next son that's at Arizona nearby. His daughter is now starting to get into, more sports and activities, and I think she's maybe 13 or 14 at this point. And so that all is going to factor in, but it would be shocking, I should say, if this was the end, and this is how he decided to go off. I just think that he's been so much. He's due his appreciation, and I think deep down he knows that.
Yeah, well said. Last one from me. I know you're getting set to switch gears and start calling some WNBA here. What are some of the storylines that you're looking forward to with the season ahead?
I just think the growth of the league is on full display right now. Obviously, the expansion speaks for itself, and Toronto and Portland has already showcased just incredible atmospheres. Golden State last year has continued that right into this year, and the talent level is just really high. The recognition's really high. I'm excited to see it up close, and Sunday I've got the Las Vegas Aces at the Atlanta Dream, and so you've got Angel Reese now in Atlanta, where it feels like they have gone all in after a really incredible regular season last year before fizzling out in the playoffs, and then you've got the Aces that have become a dynasty in this era of the W, where they've won 3 titles over the last 4 years, and A'ja Wilson's a 4-time MVP, and they still have this unbelievable nucleus with Becky Hammon running the show, and I think a lot of people are just chasing him down. But at the same time, the Liberty got a title 2 years ago and added Satou Sabally and feel like they're ready to make another crack at it. Who knows about what Minnesota could look like if Nafisa Collier makes her way back by the end of the season, but they could be really strong. Dallas now with Paige Beckers and, of course, taking Azzi Fudd, but Arike Ogunbowale, they look like a really fun team. And then, of course, everybody wants to look at Indiana and see what Caitlin Clark can do in year 3. After the injuries plagued her in year 2, she's already looking more and more like herself, and once that three-point shot starts falling, which it hasn't in the early going this season, but once it does, she really can be an unstoppable force herself. So a lot to look forward to, but I just think that the overall growth of the league has been fun to watch from the outside.
If you had to pick an NBA champ right now, Paulie?
OKC.
Yeah, I think so too. I don't think anybody's beating them. I think the Spurs are intriguing because of Wemby, but I think the Thunder is, they're the best team.
He has
in
sharp
the NBA.
elbows, too.
He does.
He'll take you out.
Well, especially when he's aiming for your jaw and he connects. We also talked plenty of lacrosse on the show today, and of course tomorrow is the national quarterfinals. Syracuse plays North Carolina in the second game on Long Island down in Hofstra. Probably, it says 2:30. It's probably going to start around 3 o'clock or so. And you say you're going to be watching, Paul.
I will be, Steve. Why is that shocking?
Well, no, because you say lacrosse isn't your thing, but I'm glad you're tuning in for the game.
Of course, during the NCAA tournament, it's kind of my job.
Well, yes, it is. It'll give us something to talk about on Monday. We did have Terry Foy on today, CEO of Inside Lacrosse. He had to be on the phone. He was traveling. He was in an airport on his way to for his coverage this weekend of the lacrosse quarterfinals. And how did we lead him off today on the, remind me? Oh, about
the winning 3 games.
Yeah, it's tough to beat a team three times in one season. And I asked him if he kind of subscribes to that theory that SU fans have been banking on, that it's tough to beat a team 3 times in 1 year.
I do, but I actually don't think that it's the most applicable factor here. I actually would put it 3rd or 4th. I think that what's more important, if you're a Syracuse fan, to be focused on is, I think, 2 things. The first was, I didn't feel like Syracuse went into the ACC tournament feeling like they either needed to win or had anything to prove. And it's not to question their motivation, but it is to say that I think, relatively speaking, Carolina probably had a little bit more of the motivation edge. And then the more important factor is just a Carolina team without Owen Duffy is much different from a Carolina team with Owen Duffy. And we don't know whether he's going to play. If he does play, I think it's fair to assume he's not going to be at full health. And then the last thing I would add is just Carolina's coming off of a game against Albany that didn't really test them, and perhaps there's a rest advantage situation there. But I am a much bigger believer in the value of the test that Syracuse had when they were taken to the limit by Yale, and I think it's gonna help them in terms of their sharpness coming out of the gate against the Tar Heels.
You brought up Owen Duffy. We had Paul Carcaterra on our show earlier in the week, and he said, bear with me here, and he laid out a scenario where he thinks it might even be better for Syracuse if Owen Duffy were to play, because as you just alluded to, it sounds like he's not going to be anywhere near 100%. And Owen Duffy being the competitor that he is, he thinks that maybe UNC would be more. Would be easier to guard, I guess, and easier to defend if he were out there, as opposed to if he's not out there. He thinks it might make them a little bit tougher to defend. What do you make of that statement, that reasoning?
Kevin Brown from Inside Lacrosse just published what has become one of my favorite features annually over the last 15 years, which is our anonymous scouting report, which is effectively you talk to as many assistant coaches whose teams are eliminated from the playoffs but have played and prepared and scouted these opponents. And one of them made that very same argument. It was less about what Carolina is with a limited Duffy, and it was a little bit more about how there are times when the ball can get sticky in his stick. And he saw a team last week that looked a little bit more free-flowing in terms of its ball movement. So I think you can kind of attack it from both angles, especially because Owen's game is so predicated on explosiveness and athleticism that an injury that might limit somebody else, call it 20%, might limit him 40%. And I don't know that we're necessarily making an optimistic case. I think it's very realistic. And I think that on top of that, one of the things that becomes so fascinating is how it informs how John Odierna and the rest of the staff will devise their defensive game plan. If all things were equal, you would probably assume, all right, we're gonna stick with the game plan that we've established, but we're gonna tweak around the margins and hope that it works there. In this scenario, I think it's justifiable to say, do we want to switch the matchup? Do we want to take a completely different approach to how we support whoever ends up guarding Owen Duffy? And I think that just a lot of the questions stem from there.
This time of year, goaltending and face-off play are so very important. I don't need to tell you that. And for Syracuse, they've gotten John Mullen. They got the John Mullen from last week, right? He certainly stepped up his play in recent weeks. And in net, Jimmy McCool was fantastic in the second half. Didn't play great in the first half against Yale, but was phenomenal down the stretch. What do you make of? We know about UNC's face-off situation. They're the best in the country there. What about the goalie situation with the Tar Heels, and what do you make of the change going into the NCAA tournament?
To reference that anonymous scouting report again, the consensus seemed to be that you cannot go back to Josh Marcus at this point. That you've made your decision to go forward with Kent Good, and you kind of have to ride with him. And I say that on the basis of having no other additional information as to whether or not even going back to the freshman is a consideration that they're working through. And so I think it's reasonable to assume that Good is going to get the start again, and then it just comes down to how well he plays. He played well enough in a game in which he wasn't tested against Albany that he certainly didn't play himself out of the situation. So I think that that's reasonable and good to be informed. But at the same time, if you're just straight up and down picking which goalie you prefer, there's no question it's Jimmy McCool. And I think that's a great source of consolation and solace for Syracuse fans. At the faceoff position, I felt like coming into this season, preseason All-Americans wise, Brady Wambach was first team, Johnny Mullen was second team. There was no debate about that. And then there was a bit of a chasm to third team and beyond. And so when these two teams were going to play, I was like, oh, this is going to be one of the most exciting kind of puzzle matchups that we're going to get. Johnny didn't have the start to the season such that it was a Clash of the Titans billing going into that game. But I think you're right to point out that he has figured some things out. And I have seen a few, I don't want to call them more cracks, but just elements of Wambach's game that weren't as dominant as they were early in the season. And I think that convergence might end up, pushing this a little bit more toward neutral. I'm not going to go so far as to predict that Syracuse can get to 50% facing off, but I do think that they can get to 40%, maybe even 45%. And the way in which that narrows the gap makes it so much more of a game about whose team's going to be more efficient, whose offense is going to be more efficient in settled 6-on-6 scenarios.
In terms of adjustments that were made from the first meeting to the second meeting, and then adjustments that you expect to be made from the second meeting to the third here, we saw John O'Derna throw some zone at North Carolina in that second game. It really seemed to limit Don Petramala in that second meeting. Do you think they will go back to that, or because they already threw it at the Tar Heels, do you think now they have to make another adjustment? And if they do, what do you think that adjustment would be on the defensive side of the ball for Syracuse?
Well, like I already said, I mean, I think the biggest adjustment stems from, do we want Riley Figueres guarding Owen Duffy? And if we feel like that's not the best deployment of his on-ball matchup, then what do we do? And I think the interesting thing about North Carolina is, they don't have a third attackman that you're particularly concerned about beating you off the dodge. And Don Petramala is a player who the most important thing about how you guard him is how well you stick onto him. And there are very few players in college lacrosse that know his game better than Billy Dewan. And so for all those reasons, I think it's reasonable that at least from a starting point, you say, all right, well, no, we don't really have a better option than what we've deployed previously. I think the element of the zone that you're talking about is really, in my opinion, difficult to divorce from the fact that they made a goalie change in the first one, right? Usually when you deploy a zone, what you're trying to do is say, we're comfortable with the shots that we're going to give up on the basis of our goalie making the shots that we're comfortable giving up. And so there's an element to that decision in the ACC game that makes me, the ACC tournament game, that makes me wonder whether it was meant to be viewed as a vote of confidence for the goalie. And I don't know the extent to which that means it's a repeatable strategy that you're going to continue to deploy. I think that more than we feel like it's the best way to defend them, a lot of times the reason you do it is because it's the best way to disrupt the flow of the game. And one of the interesting things about this is Syracuse is going to, if not need, then certainly benefit more from a couple of goals in transition. And that's not to say that you need both teams to be playing frantically, frenetically, and clearing fast in order to get, presumably, Billy Dewan into those offensive positions. But it does indicate that the odds are better if both teams are playing that way, and that would benefit Syracuse. You don't tend to play fast when you're in a zone. So that would be another argument against it if you felt like it was going to take away some of those transition opportunities.
I do have a couple big picture questions I want to ask you, but before we move on to those, you want to take a stab at a prediction for this game tomorrow?
I picked Syracuse. I picked Syracuse in my bracket. I picked Syracuse to be a Final Four team in the beginning of the season. I think this matchup is very favorable for a lot of the reasons that we just talked about. I don't know that I would have picked them against any of the other three teams that I chose to lose or that I picked to lose in my bracket or this week. So on that basis and for a variety of reasons, I feel like we're going to see Syracuse and Charlottesville.
And the more we talk about it, I mean, we've obviously been breaking down this matchup all week long, and I'm talking myself into thinking Syracuse is going to win this game. The more I hear from Paul Carcaterra and Terry Foy and Rick Beardsley, I think Cuse is going to win tomorrow, Paulie.
I don't know. We'll see.
I don't know.
I'm not going to pick against it, but I also, I'm not confident.
All right, 50-50.
I don't know. I wouldn't say 50-50. I'd go 30-70. North Carolina will win.
All right.
National Chocolate Chip Day. Steve, you're not a big chocolate guy.
I know, but I like a good chocolate chip cookie.
Bring flowers to someone day. You didn't bring me flowers today, Steve. I noticed that.
I didn't know.
I knew that all along. National Pizza Party Day. If you had a pizza party, I'd probably turn it down because I don't want a broccoli with no sauce pizza on it.
Don't knock it till you try.
Broccoli pineapple pizza?
Broccoli, pineapple, and grilled chicken. That's my go-to.
That isn't a pizza.
What is it?
I don't know. It's bread with an arrangement of weird items that don't go together. National Nylon Stocking Day.
Okay.
Not celebrating that. Peace Officers Memorial Day, Steve.
Okay.
Malcolm X Day and National Endangered Species Day.
Okay.
Radio hosts are endangered species at this time.
All right. Listen, I hope everybody has a safe and happy weekend. Enjoy it. For Paulie, I'm Steve. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you again on Monday.